To order of the March 14, 2013 regular meeting of the Regional Housing Mandate Committee. And can you call a roll, please?
Furman?
Here.
Holman?
Here.
Sharp?
Here.
Schmidt?
Here.
Four present.
And welcome Commissioner Michael and Board Member Mitchell, Board Member Caswell, and of course city staff, and members of the public as well. This is the time on the agenda when anyone would like to speak to an item that is not on the agenda. You may do so. I do have one card from Don Barr. There you are. So you'll have 3 minutes, and step to the microphone here with the...
Great. Thank you very much. I'm Don Barr, a community resident, also on the community working group, on the faculty at Stanford. And I just wanted to address the issue that I know the board members, the council members have received a letter from the attorneys of the public interest law firm of the Silicon Valley Law Foundation representing the residents of Buena Vista Mobile Home Park about the issues, and I know the school board members have seen the same, the issues raised by the proposed closure of the park. I wanted to call your attention to one issue in particular because I'm not a lawyer. But what they did was they pointed out that the closure of Buena Vista will have a disparate impact on a largely low-income Hispanic community, since 85% of the residents at Buena Vista are Hispanic, approximately. And under federal fair housing law, any action, regardless of intent, that has a disparate impact on a previously identified group, and low-income Hispanics is one of those groups, may be a violation of federal fair housing law. And the attorneys have brought this to the attention of the city council, and in your discussions about regional housing and how needs are allocated and how market rate and below market rate, I would hope that you would discuss the issue of whether there are any potential civil rights issues raised as part of your discussions, and whatever types of steps taken to address it will then address those civil rights issues, particularly mitigation or accommodation of any disparate impact on federally identified minority groups. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other cards for members of the public who want to speak on an item not on the agenda, we'll move to agenda item number 1. This is regional forecasts. The subject line is regional forecast by Levy.
Title.
So Stephen Levy will make a presentation for the Bay Area Regional Economic and Housing Forecasts, and you have provided us a presentation that you'll be going through. And can we figure 15 minutes? Had you given thought to?
Well, is the mic on?
Yes.
Okay. Normally, you will want to ask questions during it. If you choose not to, it might be 15 or 20 minutes, but sometimes it's hard to wait the questions, so I welcome questions.
Well, tell you what.
I hadn't thought about a time limit.
We always think about time limits.
Well, I mean, do you have other items or a full?
Well, we have, it doesn't matter, quite frankly. We try to keep things, manageable, but we also do have another council meeting tonight, so we need to keep that in mind, too. I should ask staff, too, did you have any comments to make prior to Mr. Levy's presentation?
Curtis Williams, Director of Planning and Community Environment. Not specific comments other than just to introduce the item as something that the committee had requested when Mr. Levy was here last, that we have a more thorough, and has set some time aside at a future meeting to have a more thorough presentation from him and an opportunity to ask questions and discuss some of the issues that are brought up through the forecasting model.
Okay. So why don't we try to address it in this way? If you could make your presentation, and if colleagues have burning questions during the presentation, just let me know. But why don't we try to get through the presentation and do follow-up questions? And we'll target 15 to 20 minutes, and we'll go from there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically, I'm here because I offered and you accepted, so I'm here for you. This is my city, and I do welcome the questions. There were a bunch. I am sorry, I have not learned how to talk both ways at once, and I need to be looking this way. I apologize. Those are the two kind of number issues that the committee and the council dealt with. I'm going to talk mainly about the first one because that's what I know the most about. Okay? There are three players in the discussion that went on in the committee and the council. There is the ABAG growth forecast, which I played a role in. There is the RENA allocation for the region, which was given to the region by the Department of Housing and Community Development of the state. And there were the new and old DOF projections that came up in a number of the meetings and memos prior to the formal appeal.
Before you go any further,
State Department of Finance.
Just for the audience's
Right.
benefit, acronyms: Association of Bay Area Governments is ABAG. RENA is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment that ABAG conducts relative to housing, and DOF is Department of Finance. I think Stephen will probably also talk about HCD, which is the Department of Housing and Community Development for the state.
Okay.
Curtis.
Since the mid-1970s, the federal government, primarily the Department of Transportation, has provided money to regional and local planning agencies, really to fulfill an effort that grew out of the 70s and some of the turmoil in the 60s to beef up the planning staffs in big regions. It's primarily funded by transportation because that's the major long-term infrastructure that really is regional. People commute across the Bay Area, and the federal government thought that regions would be served by having a long-term growth forecast, the number of jobs, the number of people, where they would located to plan transportation and other infrastructure. The current cycle of growth forecast in California go either to 2035 or 2040. The one we did for ABAG goes to 2040. Okay. The big technical point is that the overwhelming practice in doing these growth forecasts, whether they're done by agencies in the state of California or they're done by big national forecasting firms that sell their services around the country, is that job growth is a major determinant of population growth. That's the theoretical basis, whether I do it or virtually anybody else does it. I've worked recently for 5 of the regional planning agencies, but the ones I don't work for use the same framework as do all of the big national firms. That doesn't mean we do the same assumptions. That doesn't mean the assumptions I did are right by virtue of the fact that everybody used the methodology. The key question for the Bay Area or any region in doing this work is assessing that region's competitive position for job growth, and people can have different opinions, but the job growth drives the population. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. People surged into the region from other states and other countries in the late 1990s with the tech boom. People left with the dot-com bust. The auto companies didn't leave Detroit because the people left Detroit. The people left Detroit because the auto production went down. But it's the key theoretical determinant.
Mr. Levy, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be interested in this, and you, like I, talk with your hands a lot, so if you could make sure that the hand that you're not talking
Thank
with
you.
is-
Thank you. My wife usually does that, and she's at home. Okay. The growth forecast extends to 2040. The regional housing needs assessment, which has been an issue in Palo Alto and many other cities, is an 8-year time frame. I think the current one is 2014 to 2022, so it's much shorter than the growth forecast. The Department of Housing and Community Development of the state, in particular, two people named Glenn Campura and Andra Dragici, I usually get the name wrong, are the staff there, and they deal with the regional planning agencies and give them an overall regional target, which ABAG then allocates among the cities. They do that now in, they look at the Department of Finance forecast, because part of the legislation that they operate under says that if the regional planning agency is close to within 3% of the Department of Finance forecast, that's acceptable, but the legislation also says that HCD can work with the regions and use other projections. Okay? Given the population, the regional housing allocation is based on presumed household forming behavior. What will seniors do? Will they stay in their house? How many kids will live with their parents? And vacancy rates. It gets pretty technical. The Palo Alto allocation, all of the city allocations are done by a formula agreed to by a subcommittee at ABAG made up of basically mayors and council members and supervisors. I have nothing to do with that. Okay. The Department of Finance uses a methodology that derives initially from their expertise in projecting birth rates and death rates, fertility and mortality, and they have to make an assumption about migration. That is a direct quote from their current document that accompanied the current projections that have been subject to discussion. They are supposed to rely on the expertise of local agencies. That is, they were supposed to consult with ABAG. And the reason they do that is that they know that they do not incorporate any economic considerations into the development of migration assumptions. And to do that, they have a working arrangement with the regional councils of government, in this case ABAG. That's what they're supposed to do, right? In the regional allocation that was given to ABAG, the timing was such that HCD did not in fact consult with ABAG and delivered the regional total before the ABAG growth forecast was given. So the ABAG growth forecast had nothing to do with the regional allocation of which Palo Alto got a share. If HCD had consulted with ABAG, there would have been a higher regional total. Okay. DOF did not consult with ABAG and developed migration assumptions based on looking at the decade of 2000 to 2010. They did consult with ABAG's sister agency in Southern California, and the result was there's very little discrepancy between the DOF projection of population in Southern California and what the regional planning agency did because they consulted. So that's the process. So if you want to stop, if there are any questions about the process. Neither HCD nor DOF followed the methodology that they were supposed to in order to incorporate the regional agency's job growth projections. Right? So, both the weekly editorial and possibly my memory fades a bit, some members of the council thought that the ABAG growth forecast was unreasonable or too high. So the next part of the discussion is information about that, because that would be relevant. I don't think it's relevant legally, but it would be, relevant to ordinary people whether the growth forecast that was not used for the RENA was too high. See? So when we did it, and that was late 2011 and published in early, I think the date on the document was maybe March or February 2012 that you distributed. At that time, we used what was a more conservative set of national projections about population and growth and immigration than anybody else had. And so the ABAG forecast started out with a fairly conservative national base. I did project forecast that the Bay Area would have job growth that slightly exceeded the national rate. I'll explain why, but that is the basis for the job and population growth. The population growth then followed the job growth with two more conservative assumptions. Under SB 375, it can be interpreted that a region is supposed to provide housing for all of its job growth. All right? I didn't think that made sense in the Bay Area. That's not the historical pattern. Some people commute from San Benito or Salinas. Some people commute from Tracy. We are a region that has historically had people living outside the region that feed the jobs in here. And so the projection that came out did allow some continued commuting. And so it was conservative. We could have said all those households that fill the jobs have to be in the Bay Area, and then the Bay Area numbers would have been even higher. But we didn't. And finally, ABAG did recognize at the regional level a small housing constraint, and so they lowered the numbers that I gave them even more. So I would characterize this as fairly conservative when we did it. Those are the numbers. The blue bar is the rate of job growth in the Bay Area, the California, U.S. And you can see for the big period, the 2020-2040 period, the growth rates are virtually identical. The Bay Area does grow a little bit faster. Why would that be reasonable besides the fact that it's happening now? The central point when you think about the future of the Bay Area economy is its industry structure. And so what this chart says is we have about 2.5% of all the jobs in the nation. But in these big sectors, which really determine whether a region does better or not, we have far and often far, far above 2.4%. We have a strong competitive advantage. You know that if you walk down University Avenue, or you drive or take the train through Santa Clara County, or you go to San Francisco. The Bay Area is the center for the internet and for all sorts of mobile applications and for huge services around pharmaceuticals. And we still have a very large share of computer and electronic manufacturing. So the basic thing, if you were to challenge the ABAG projections, is to somehow make a case economic base that the Bay Area should grow slower than the nation. And now, so that's what we did in ending in, around the end of 2011. So what's been happening since? And in theory, the Department of Finance projections, the one that have been referenced in the memos floating around here, which were published in January 13, should have looked around and seen what was happening. Okay, so the next part of the presentation, and then we're basically done, is what's been happening recently. Well, recently, despite this horrible recession and the number of people who are still unemployed, the Bay Area has job growth that substantially outpaces the nation. And virtually everybody, I don't do short-term forecasts, but UCLA does and some other people do, and they all have the Bay Area growing faster than the nation in the near-term future, and I think you can see that around. That's something that DOF could have known. We added 72,000 jobs a year. In those 2 years, it was still the beginning of the recovery, not the full recovery. Well, the long-term projection was 41,000 jobs a year. The near-term projection that I made that I would revise upward was about 69,000. And the job growth goes way down. I know Greg was concerned correctly that job growth is going to slow in the future. And we have a very low rate of job growth for the last 20 years because people are retiring and jobs aren't growing anyhow. But in any event, if you look around at what's happened recently, even before the recovery gets going, the numbers are completely consistent with the 2040 growth forecast. Talk a bit about DOF. There are kind of 4 reasons to be cautious for any city in using them or trumpeting them. First of all, they didn't use their own methodology, which is kind of a killer. Second of all, as I show you, they're not consistent with anything that's going on the ground. They have some very strange migration assumptions for Santa Clara County, and remember, Palo Alto's allocation is based on the Santa Clara County allocation. That's the way they do it, and so if they've got Santa Clara County wrong, low, it's going to make Palo Alto low. And the final thing
What
is
is their strange migration assumptions?
I'll show you. They have people leaving Santa Clara County between 2016 and 2020. I'll show you.
Where are they going?
I don't know. All right. I'm out. All right. The left-hand side is the Department of Finance annual migration assumption into the Bay Area for the next 10 years. 5,200 a year, okay? In the 2 years of the beginning recovery, before the full recovery, the actual migration, according to the Department of Finance, who knew this in July, was 22,650 a year, okay? But today, the Census Bureau, and there is an issue about who's a better guide to this, the Census Bureau or the Department of Finance, published their numbers, so I couldn't get them on the chart that came out at 10 o'clock this morning, said the actual net migration into the Bay Area for the past 2 years was 44,000. So that's one piece of strange. Okay. The population growth that DOF projected for this 10-year period was 43,300 a year. On their own data, for the first 2 years of the recovery, it was 65,000. And the number that's not on there is the Census Bureau estimate that came out today that the Bay Area added 90,200 people a year in the 2 years ending last July. So there's strong evidence that whatever went on, DOF was not attuned to what was going on in the ground in the Bay Area in the last couple of years that you all would see by walking the street. Okay? What I meant by strange migration for Santa Clara County, DOF in the 10 years that we are now in says that 3,700 people a year will leave the county, despite job growth that makes Santa Clara the largest, fastest growing metropolitan area in its size class. Okay? The actual data from the DOF that they could have looked at was in the first 2 years of the recovery, we added 6,300 migrants a year in the county. All right? And sorry, I'm not too good with this. And real number from the, well, not the real number, the alternate number from the Department of Census for the first 2 years is that Santa Clara County added 10,000 migrants a year. So there are reasons in the current data to be cautious about using DOF. And there is this technical thing, this ongoing dispute between the Department of Finance and the Census Bureau that have different methodologies. And in the 10-year period between 2000 and 2010, the Department of Finance was wrong. I thought they were right. But when the census data came out, the Bay Area had 7.2 million people, and in the year before that, the Department of Finance had estimated we had 7.5. So relying on the Department of Finance, which didn't use their own methodology, which has numbers that don't conform to what's going on now, and in the prior case, as a mistake.
But they overestimated prior 10 years. You're saying they're underestimating now.
Right, they are. They did, and they are.
What was ABAG in the prior 10 years? Did they overestimate or underestimate?
You need to use the microphone, Mr. Levy.
Sure. I guess the fair answer is that the prior ABAG methodology was discredited. It's a very difficult conversation. It's why I'm doing it now. The person was fired. I suspect everybody doing it, or I had done it, I would have relied on DOF. I would have thought that there were more people here than there turned out to be. But it's not, it's apples to oranges. It's not doing it the same way we did now. We don't need to do this one. This one just shows the huge difference in the California estimates between the two. There is one piece of the new Department of Finance projections that ABAG will incorporate, and if they were to do it again and have the same jobs, they'd have about 100,000 fewer people, because the fertility rate is going down. If we'd known it at the time, we would have incorporated it. They'll do it next time, so instead of 9.3 million people in 2040, they would have had 9.2 million people, and we'll adjust that. So that's the end of that part. I have only one slide here. When I look back at the draft RENA allocation before the appeal that Palo Alto submitted, Palo Alto was allocated 3.7% of the roughly 60,000 units allocated to Santa Clara County. In 2012, we had 3.6% of the county population, and the city folks tell me we had about 8% to 10% of the county jobs. So I'm actually surprised, knowing the methodology that ABAG used, that Palo Alto didn't get 4 or 5% of the housing allocation given those shares. And as I said last week, and as I told the folks at ABAG, the appeal touches a very legitimate topic, and I can relay back to you that ABAG understands that, and they're working to resolve it. And I understand from Curtis the appeal will be reviewed on April 1st.
Staff still recommended against it. I said staff still recommended against Palo Alto's appeal.
ABAG staff.
Came out yesterday.
What?
Came out yesterday.
Oh, it did.
Okay. I don't think there's anything else.
All right, thank you very much. And I don't have any cards for members of the public. I know colleagues have, they need to be turned in up here so that we, or Curtis can take them.
ABAG staff, it sounds like.
So I know colleagues will have questions or comments. I know Councilmember Schmidt has comments. And first, though, I think I will, I only have one card. So, Jane Sedaris, welcome.
Yes,
Well,
Thanks for-
thank you for letting me speak before you. I'm Jane Sedaris. I live in Palo Alto on Georgia Avenue. I'm very concerned about all this growth that is occurring, even though I'm responsible for part of that growth because I moved here in 1952. I don't understand all of this, so I will tell you that to begin with because it just is blowing my mind right now. But what I'm very concerned about is that we are changing so rapidly in this city, and we've had to swallow so much so quickly, and buildings are going up all around us so fast, and the city has changed its zoning. It has changed height laws. It has changed density laws. And so it's changing our city dramatically. And I'm very concerned about ABAG because I don't understand where ABAG is coming from, even with all of this explanation, and why they have so much control over what we have to build. And if we have to build what ABAG tells us and change our zoning laws to do it, change our height laws to do it, change our density laws to do it, it's changing our town dramatically, and it's changing the quality of our life. And I don't understand why we don't encourage maybe other cities to take on some of this tax jobs growth. Why don't they work on asking other communities to provide jobs and make more Palo Altos throughout the state where we all love to live? But it's changing too rapidly, and I think we need to take a step back, and I think we need to put those two paragraphs back in the letter to ABAG that says the numbers are far too high. Where are we going to build them? I don't want to live near on a high-density building next to a railroad track. I've done that, been there. I don't want to live in high density. I've done that. I've lived in Europe. I know what it's like. I loved Palo Alto when I moved here, and I know a lot of people did too, and I know they'd all like to come here, but let's build some other Palo Altos someplace else, and let's stop building us so rapidly. I think we need to stop and move backwards a little bit. And I think you need just to witness what's happened to Gunn High School, which is in my backyard. I'm now living in a parking lot. It's lit up every night. It lights up the whole back of my house. You have the city has transported kids and caused a terrible amount of traffic on the Arastadero and a terrible amount of traffic down at the Embarcadero with the growth of the two high schools because they didn't open Cubberley. So we've made some giant mistakes, and I think it's a big mistake to let ABAG just come in here and tell us what to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is another card. Dave Masters, and you also have 3 minutes. Thank you for coming.
I say that again.
Thank you for coming. You'll have 3 minutes as well.
Okay, 2 minutes?
3.
3 minutes? I have questions. First of all, are we committed to ABAG?
I think if you'll go ahead and finish.
Are we committed? Is Palo Alto committed to fall in line with ABAG?
If you would make your statements, then we'll respond when it comes back to the council and
Oh, you mean I can't ask you questions?
Well, you can, but we'll respond to them after you finish speaking, if that's agreeable to you.
Well, basically, I don't understand why you would want to take money for being enslaved, so to speak. You know, if you take money from ABAG, they're giving it to you so they can tell you what to do. I don't really think that's necessary. And the other part about it is where's the money coming from? Do any of you believe that any government, the federal government, the state government, has money that they can throw at these projects? You people are just soaking up money, basically, because it's coming and you think it's free. And it isn't free. I find it really disconcerting that, like California Avenue, You get a grant for for changes on California Avenue. Nobody on California Avenue wants it. Those of us that go to California Avenue don't want it. But because you people can soak up the money, you're going to force it on the people in the city. Who are you representing? Are you representing the people of Palo Alto? Or are you representing ABAG or whoever the hell they are? It's really disconcerting.
Thank you. And I don't see any other cards, so first, oh, there's one more card. Okay. If there are any other cards, if you would hand them in now, that would be great.
All the cards.
Does anyone else have a card?
Hi, my name is Sally Gadiro, and I live at 891 Rourke Avenue in Palo Alto. I want to tell you a little something that happened to me this morning. I was visiting with a friend who had just come back to Palo Alto after being gone 2 years. And we were sitting around having a wonderful breakfast, birthday breakfast for her. And she says, "I'll never, ever," this is quote, "come back to Palo Alto." And we all agreed, 6 of us that were around the table. And I said, we all feel this way. I wonder how much the city of Palo Alto understands we feel this way. My son, who loves Palo Alto and said he would never leave it, said, "Mom, I was at El Camino and San Antonio this morning. It was an absolute mess. It's a mess everywhere with the cars. I see the kids at school, and I wonder if there's going to be enough schools for them in a year or so. I wonder if our streets are going to be large enough to handle this traffic. I wonder how long we want to wait at the stoplights. This is hurting us. We're feeling bad. Palo Alto, we felt so privileged to live here. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much. And do you still have one more? Okay, George Young.
I just have a sort of a general question. I live on Embarcadero Road, and about 20 years ago we did a study of Friends of Embarcadero, and I remember reading one figure that there were about 75,000 commuters into Palo Alto and Stanford each day. Now I think the town was 56,000, and I realize that you have to separate off Stanford, but I'm just asking, can you tell me how many commuters into Palo Alto from neighboring towns or from Tracy we have each day versus how many jobs in Palo Alto?
Okay, thank you very much. And before we go to colleagues for comments or questions, would staff care to respond to some of the questions that have been asked, like are we committed to ABAG?
Yes, thank you. First of all, as far as ABAG goes, the city, as almost all cities in the Bay Area, are a part of ABAG. There are a number of functions ABAG has apart from housing allocations, and there are good reasons to participate in those. What I would say as far as the housing issue goes is ABAG is sort of the vessel from the state housing law requirements to the cities. So ABAG didn't create the laws that require housing elements and the planning on the housing side, but they are the one, and they're not the ones who decide, as Mr. Levy said, how much new housing the Bay Area is allocated or is projected to have. That comes to them from the state agencies, Department of Finance, Housing, Community Development. What they are responsible for is once they get that pot, which in this case is 187,000 homes over the next 8 years, or 2014 to 22, 2 time frame. They're responsible for delegating, allocating that amongst the 100 or so jurisdictions that are in the Bay Area. So they do that through a process. Mayor Scharf was on the committee that went through this process a year or so ago, and then the allocations are based on various formulas. So that is ABAG's role. If a city is not part of ABAG, it's not going to reduce their housing numbers any. They're going to get it from the state instead of from ABAG. It's going to be the same kind of thing, because those allocations have to be made statewide, and yes, it is true. And so the city is, no city is exempted from requiring with housing element law. And so again, ABAG has a lot of different functions. It also transmits a lot of the along with MTC, a lot of the transportation dollars that cities get and that kind of thing. But that's kind of its role in the housing flow. On the commuters and jobs issues, I don't know that breakdown precisely. I do know that we generally use the number of having a daytime job population of approximately 100,000 jobs in the city. So you can do the math. That probably does mean at least 75,000 of those come from outside the city.
So, Curtis, I just want to ask you a quick question. I heard from a lot of our speakers this issue that we only follow what ABAG tells us to because they give us money. And that's a general belief in the community that ABAG gives us money, and so we follow what they tell us to do. And I know that one of our neighboring cities, Menlo Park, did not follow ABAG for 20 years, and that led to a lawsuit that they ended up settling. Can you explain some of the other penalties that could be applied, including the most stringent penalties that could be applied to Palo Alto if we do not meet these housing allocations that ABAG and the state tell us to do?
Yes, so there are certain grants that we are eligible for, both on the transportation side and on the housing side, because if a city has a compliant housing element, meaning the numbers ABAG has set forth. So if you're not compliant with that, then you're not eligible for those grants. So that is one function of this process. But the other is that housing element law is a state law. We are required to do that in order to have a legal, compliant, comprehensive plan. And if we don't have that, then we're subject to litigation that we don't have a viable plan and that various actions can be taken against the city. There are, I don't know if attorneys are here, but there are probably a half dozen cities in the state over the last decade or so that have been sued, generally by nonprofit housing advocates, because they do not have that requirement, and they have, in some cases, been able to, this was what was threatened against Menlo Park, stop all forms of building permits, including either bathroom remodels or any other types of permits. They also have some authority to determine a time frame for you to develop a compliant housing element, and probably have authority, although I don't know that this has been used before, to, if the city does not do that, to essentially appoint someone to come up with that housing element and dictate to a city where that housing is going to go. So I don't think we've gotten that far. Menlo Park, in its case, paid attorney's fees that I think were over $100,000 to the attorneys that brought the suit, and now are paying over $1 million to consultants to come up with housing plans to comply with not only their current requirements, but back from periods before this one as well. So they're in the middle of that process. You might have seen they just recently had a hearing to look at several sites in the community that might be designated for that housing, and so it's a pretty, they're going through a pretty scrutiny process due to non-compliance for the last 2 decades, essentially. So that is out there. There's no assurance that would happen to Palo Alto if we don't apply, but it's possible.
I think Mayor Scharf has a follow-up.
Yeah, I think I just want to put this in more simple terms. It's not ABAG. If you're upset with someone, it's your state legislatures. It's not ABAG. ABAG gets an allocation of 185,000 units this year, and then they have to divvy them up through the different cities in the Bay Area. And there's that process. But it's really your state legislatures that say you have to build, or you have to not build, you have to zone for housing in your community based on this allocation that HCD? That HCD gives you. And it's not a matter of not complying with ABAG. We don't comply with ABAG. What we have to do is get a certified housing element. And we have to put those numbers, ABAG gives you numbers, and you have to zone for the numbers that ABAG gives you. And if you zone for those numbers, to make it simple, you get a certified housing element. If you don't zone for the numbers that ABAG gives you, then you don't get a certified housing element. And so it's having that certified housing element is what Menlo Park hasn't had for 20 years. So it's not ABAG that tells you you have to have certified housing element. It's the state of California that tells you that. And that's in state law. And that's our legislators. So they're the ones you should write to. You should write to our legislators and say, you know, you're forcing us to build this in Palo Alto because you're forcing us to zone for that. And that's really who the anger should be directed at. It's really not ABAG. I mean, ABAG is just a bureaucracy that then, you know, takes these numbers and sends them out.
And so with that, I know colleagues, and thank you also, Curtis, for responding to questions as well as colleagues. And I know Councilmember Scharf has some comments that he wants to make. I'm sorry.
I made
Thank you for the compliment.
It's the Greg's trick. Councilmember Schmidt has some comments that he wants to make, and both probably in general and also as a comparison to other perspectives to the presentation that Mr. Levy made as well. So we'll get a broad spectrum here. Councilmember Schmidt.
Thank you. I want to thank Steve for the presentation. He voluntarily agreed to do this, came, presented material. He answered the questions that had been asked at previous meetings very directly and gave a sense of the methodology that he and ABAG has used. And I don't want to dispute anything that he said, but rather I'd just like to make a comment on what's up with the Department of Finance. How can they be so different from what Steve just told us? And if I could get the approval of the committee to take just a couple minutes and try and express what I think the Department of Finance was talking about. Now, the Department of Finance is important in all these things. The Department of Housing's website, where they talk about the housing law, specifically says we get our projections from the Department of Finance. That is where the process starts. If you look at the legal government code, it says the Department of Finance is responsible for this. So how is it that in their most recent long-term forecast, the Department of Finance sees numbers 40% lower than the one Bay Area plan or jobs housing scenario that is driving the ABAG numbers? What's the reason for that discrepancy? What's the Department of Finance thinking about? Well,
Want an answer to that?
No, I just want to make a comment. I don't want to have a...
We'll come back.
Yeah. Let me try and get inside of the Department of Finance and think through. They had a traumatic experience. In 2010, they were making projections of California's population from 2010 to 2040. When the census numbers came out in February of 2011, they were off the California total population incremental projection by 56%. They were off on the Bay Area forecast by 55%. They did a little better job on the 3 West Bay counties. They were only off by some 40%. But think of the official state demographer sitting there saying, my God, how could I have been so wrong?
And you're talking about being over.
Yes, over projection. Well, it turns out when the details started coming out, it was clear that it was the migration numbers that did it. They had forecast a steady in-migration to California following long-term historical trends of 177,000 people per year. Turns out in the decade between 2000 and 2010, starting very early in the decade, that number turned negative. And actually it averaged about minus 15 per year. Now migration has 2 pieces to it: international migration and domestic migration. International migration remained positive, but domestic migration overwhelmed it. We're losing our young. So the Department of Finance had to deal with that when they made their long-term forecast. And what did they look at? They looked at the experience. Let's take our own community, Santa Clara Valley. What did they see? If I could put just a couple numbers up on the board. Is it possible to
Just
Oh.
sorry.
Okay.
Do you believe it? We even have to off a blackboard.
Well, I haven't used it.
Right on the wall.
Let me just cite some numbers.
Oh, just right on the wall.
Between 2000 and 2010, Santa Clara lost in number of employees in the county dropped from 944,000 to 756,000, a drop of 20%. At the same time, average wages went up from 80,000 to 92,000. Now, that's sort of surprising. You think of losing employees, you think of a depression, you think of Detroit. It didn't happen. And you look down at what happened to those employees. Manufacturing employees dropped 40% in Santa Clara County. Salaries went up 10%, average salaries in manufacturing. Information jobs went up 3%, a little bit, but salaries, average salaries went up 42%. Finance, it was -8, +35. Leisure and trade, -11 in jobs, +20 in average salaries. Overall, -20 in jobs, +15 in salaries. Now, if you look at that number, I mean, what does it tell you? Total salaries paid in the Valley were about the same in 2010 as they were in 2000. But fewer people were getting those salaries. There was a major transformation of industry taking place in the Valley, where they were pushing out jobs that paid small amounts of money, hiring talented people to come in to push ideas. They decided you didn't have to make things here. You didn't have to have the national sales force here, the marketing department. That could be done through partnerships and affiliations. Looking at this, what it says is jobs do not drive the economy. You can have a very, very healthy, prosperous economy with fewer jobs. Look at New York City. If you did a model on jobs in New York City in 1970, it said prosperity is driven by the number of jobs. To reach today's per capita income in New York City, you need to have 12 million people in the city. But no, they have the same number of people, about 7.5 million, as they had in 1970. It's a mature economy in which ideas, productivity, drives the economy. Now that's where California is, and I think that's what the Department of Finance is saying. California is reaching a mature state where they do not need the same growth in jobs they have had historically to produce the same income or higher incomes. Now, that's a dispute between the Department of Finance and the One Bay Area Plan that says you need jobs, you need to count the number of jobs in order to have prosperity. Now, that's a valid discussion to have when you're doing forecasting. One footnote, though, the law says the Department of Finance should set the demographic assumptions underneath the plan. And that's not true of the plan we're operating under. It is set by HCD and ABAG, independent of the Department of Finance. So, question is, I think there are two alternate ways of looking at future growth and prosperity. I think the Department of Finance has picked the right one. It's not dependent on the number of people who fit in an area, the prosperity. We still have fewer workers in the valley than we did in the year 2000. It'll take us 2 years of current growth to reach the level of employment we had in 2000. And yet no one would argue that we're not prosperous, that we're not doing well, that housing prices aren't going up. Demand for high-level business offices are going up. And that's wonderful. But it's a different model than the one presented by ABAG, HCD, and the One Bay Area Plan. So,
Well, they're very different perspectives indeed. And first I'll look to staff to see if you have any thoughts or comments.
I don't. I think I'd like to have the rest of the group. I've got a couple of questions, but my guess is they're going to get asked from the rest of the group, so I'll lay back, and if they aren't, I'll ask them at the end. But I think
Okay.
it's your meetings.
All right, and I think Mr. Levy had one response or one thought to share, and you need a microphone.
Sure,
please.
absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, Greg, the official DOF methodology for incorporating the economy is written on their website. The DOF methodology for determining migration is to talk with the regional planning agencies, in this case ABAG. They didn't do it. Okay? It was a mistake. They did it in some regions, they didn't do it. So that's the first point. They didn't follow their methodology. I've been in personal discussions with HCD for 2 regional planning agencies, and their official methodology is to look at the Department of Finance and listen to the case presented by the regional planning agencies. And in both of the cases that I dealt with, they went with what the regional planning agency said. Okay? The Department of Finance did not follow their methodology with regard to ABAG. Now, it's all well and good to say that the region can be prosperous without job growth. I wouldn't argue with that. But the facts on the ground and the mandate of the law is to deal with the job growth that is occurring. And why DOF, which published its numbers in January 2013, did not notice the 72,000 jobs a year that had been added is beyond me, okay? They weren't, for some reason, looking at what was actually going on. The purpose of doing the forecast is to understand how the future can be different. And in fact, I guess the easiest example is that if you had forecasted age distribution based on what happened over the last 20 years, you'd have seen a lot of young families. But in fact, everybody that does it knows that if you're 50 in 2010, you're going to be 70 in 2030. The future changes. And it is perfectly legitimate and standard practice to assess the potential for job growth in the Bay Area. If you want to disagree with what we did and say that the Bay Area is going to be a lagging economy in terms of job growth, I would disagree, but that's a legitimate point of contention. Okay?
Right.
We have slowing growth.
Okay.
Right? Let me just add one more thing at a very practical level. The demographer who had done all of the DOF projections for 30 years retired at the beginning of this. There are two new people, Bill Schooling and Walter Schwarm. They'd never done this before. They inherited a set of models in which they got little technical assistance on this. They are brand new at this, and everybody was scurrying around. So it's understandable, perhaps, that they didn't talk with ABAG or take into consideration the job growth, but they're brand new people. They're not the whole staff.
Thank you. And Councilmember Sharp, I know you have questions or comments.
I do. So, I'm looking on page 6. I don't know if you've got that in
Is
front
that
of
one
you.
of the charts?
No. It's here. I don't know if it's...
Oh, it's the ABAG report.
Yeah. So this is the disconnect that I seem to be struggling with. When I look at, and I'm looking at the Bay Area share of U.S. jobs, but if I look at the actual jobs created too, it would follow this similarly. Is what I see is a trend where, you know, you have an up, and then you have a down in the Bay Area. And where you are right now, in 2010 to 2013, is you're going on that up. And so it seems to me that when you say the Bay Area added 72,000 jobs per year in the first years of the recovery, I say, so what? When you look at these things, they shoot up in a fast trajectory when you look at the past history of this stuff. But at the end of the day, when you look at from 1990 to 2000, the Bay Area share of U.S. jobs remained unchanged. And you look at, in 2000, the Bay Area share of U.S. jobs, if you looked between 2000 and 2010, it had shrunk dramatically. So, but if you look at over 20 years, you know, from 1990, and we go all the way up to 220, you know, you're showing from 2010 to 2020 on this, or I don't know who is, maybe not you. You're showing a sharp increase for the whole 10 years. That may or may not be true. Right? I mean, and historically, you would say it's not true. So that's the disconnect I'm sort of having, is it seems that you're taking the first 2 years and saying 72,000 jobs a year, that's going to continue on for the next 10 years. Whereas that doesn't seem to be what's happening in the past. It doesn't seem that way. Am I missing that?
And as we do have a meeting that's coming up after this one, I need to ask people to be concise in their questions and, unfortunately, in their answers as well.
So those were the projections that we used. That's what we're looking at, a very high share of the nation's fastest growing
Microphone, sir.
If you had taken 1997 instead of 2000, then it looks pretty flat, which is close to what we have. We went way up in the dot-com boom, and then the Bay Area suffered this huge recession that nobody else did when the dot-com bust came, right? We're not projecting that. No one that I know that does this regional analysis, whether it's the national forecasting firms, and I've looked at them all, or UCLA, which came up and did a presentation on the Bay Area economy, no one has the Bay Area lagging the nation into the future for basically the reason. So if you want to say that we're all mischaracterizing the fact that starting from 2010, the Bay Area has a favorable economy, you're entitled to that opinion, but you're not just disagreeing with me. You're disagreeing with everybody that looks at it. You're disagreeing with the expansions that are going on all over the valley where the employees haven't even been put in for Google and Samsung and Microsoft. You're disagreeing with the activity that's going on up and down University Avenue that's bidding up rents as people come in.
Because actually that's not true. What we've been talking about is a boom and bust cycle. And right now
Right.
you're in the boom cycle. And so when you say you're disagreeing with it, no, I'm saying what you're doing is you're disagreeing with the historical trends of a boom and bust cycle. And I'm not arguing with you. I'm asking you the question of why you think it's different this time. In fact, that was the title of the book, if I recall. I mean, why do you think the boom and bust cycle is not going to occur in the next 10 years when it seems to have occurred every time before? That's really the issue. Why take the 2 years now and say that's going to happen and everyone agrees it's going to happen? And also, I just think your characterization of a recession between 2000 and 2010, as Greg pointed out, incomes went up. When incomes go up, it's not a recession. What happens is we didn't create jobs. That's the interesting part.
Well,
and I don't mean to be
no,
to attack you, but that's the fundamental issue I have.
Okay. You can disagree with the job growth for the United States. What I did was look at a broad consensus of what industries are growing in the U.S. and by how much, looked at the pattern of shares in these industries, all of which we have strong competitive advantage in, and made a projection. I'm not increasing in the ABAG projection the Bay Area share of those jobs. What the projections are saying, whether I did or UCLA or Remy, is that at this point in time, the Bay Area has a high share of industries that other people project to grow rapidly in the United States. You would have to disagree with that. You would have to provide a reason based on industries and what's going on the ground why the Bay Area would lag the nation going forward. Right? You can't just point to the history. So I'm doing this in Southern California, all right? Southern California got hammered in the 1990s. And so if you start at 1990 and you look out to 2010, Southern California never regained the share of jobs that they had. But there are no more military bases to close disproportionately, and most of the aircraft jobs in the Bay Area and Southern California are gone. It's a one-time phenomena that made those share drops. You have to deal not with the history, but with the current mix of industries. The special factor in 2007, 2008 was a huge housing bust. So if you want to say that's going to happen again, despite the fact that we're adding 90,000 people a year, that we're going to have a housing bust and not build more housing and add those jobs, you're entitled, but it's not consistent with what we're seeing on the ground. And no, I'm not saying that 72,000 jobs a year will continue forever. The 30-year average was 41,000, and it falls off very sharply after 2020. Because a part of this is a recovery in the U.S. and every place. Part of these jobs are just a recovery as the recession fades.
So I think we have another question or comment by Councilmember Schmidt.
Oh, just very briefly, I think it's shown around the world, whether you look at New York City, Washington, D.C., and Germany, London, that the number of people in the labor force does not determine the prosperity of the country or the growth in incomes in that country. Number two, I just make the case of the Department of Finance. You know, you put up the latest numbers from yesterday's E6. It shows clearly that through 2012, there has been a net out migration from California averaging 13,000 people per year over the last 3 years, which is exactly on course with the Department of Finance's long-term forecast. So they seem to have caught something.
Well, you know, this just goes round and round, Karen, okay? The Census Bureau, which was right in the decade you were so proud of, has in-migration. The Census Bureau has much higher numbers than DOF, and DOF's own numbers for the past 2 years are incredibly higher than their projections. It's like they didn't look at what happened and they assumed that the decade from 2000 to 2010 with 2 recessions was the future. If you believe that, you're entitled to your numbers. But no one else that does 30-year forecasting is projecting 2 major recessions a decade. You have to make the case that the economy is in 30-year tank. And
I think it's important to have the discussion. I want us all to just be mindful that they are different perspectives. The numbers are very hard to digest, for one.
they're not different perspectives. They butched their methodology. They didn't consult with the people. They didn't intend to do it the way Greg said. They intended to consult with ABAG, like they did with SACOG and like they did with SCAG. They just didn't follow their methodology.
So I know that board members and commissioners have comments, so we'll start with Commissioner Michael. And you need a microphone, yes.
So I'm Mark Michael. I'm Vice Chairman of the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission has been working with the staff on the housing element and other pieces of the comprehensive plan, which will in due course go to the council for approval.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah. Anyway, so is this on?
But you just need to speak louder.
Oh, okay. I'm shy and mild-mannered, so I will try to overcome that. Anyway, so the housing element that has been submitted, which has an aspect of an appeal of some small part of the total number, represents the period from 2007 to 2014. So once this gets resolved one way or another, that period will be effectively over. And I think that what I've impressed with the comment from the people who spoke from the public is there are a lot of strong feelings and emotions among the residents of Palo Alto about the impact this has on the quality of our city. The housing element begins with the vision statement of the importance of preserving the quality of life and the character of the city. And very few people have been attending the discussions at the Planning Commission level regarding what our objectives would be for the housing element. We're about to start the period from 2008 or 2014 to 2022, which will be the new housing element. And I would really appreciate the maximum amount of public participation and engagement from the beginning to the end of the process so that we can get this right. And I think I had the honor of serving with Mr. Levy on the Infrastructure Blue Ribbon Commission, and I'm a big admirer of his work. And we had in a different context last night the issue of everybody's entitled to their opinion, but we're all not entitled to our own facts. And it's important to understand what of the different data sets are most relevant. But I think that at issue, I understand the appeal that was filed is a relatively small adjustment between the city and the county, not the fact that we need a housing element, to avoid liability that would not be in the city's best interest, and that the going forward interest of the city in the quality of life is going to be best served by the citizens, the residents, like today, coming out and telling us what's important, and please come to the Planning Commission, because important things happen at that level as they do here. So
I appreciate the promotion of that. Board Member Caswell.
First of all, I want to say that I appreciate in doing the forecasting, Mr. Levy, that you took a look at the share of jobs in selected industries. But I, too, share Mayor Scharf's questions about looking at the next 20 years going forward. I think you do want to look at what our share is of different jobs, although that could change over time. But historically, the business cycle goes up and down, and it's hard for me, with my background, with an MBA, to say that we could go out 20 years and just have an upcycle. It's not historically what's happened in this country, and I doubt it's going to be historically what happens in this area, even if we do better than the rest of the country. So I just wanted to share that.
Board Member Mitchell?
I have a question and a comment. Do we know what transportation funds we've received from the state since 2000? Or I'm sure you do.
We know, but I don't know at this moment. And it's a long list of funds, and most of them have nothing to do with housing element compliance. But we've had some.
I think there's
in the last couple of years that are dependent on that, but.
And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I think the question has come up over and again about the associated revenues from the state related to the ABAG compliance issue. You mentioned several other reasons why it's important to have a certified housing element, but it would be valuable to know what transportation funds we've actually received.
I would say that overall, the total transportation funds that we received from the state, the ones that we get grants through VTA for that are reliant on a compliant housing element are a very small percentage of that.
Okay. And I think I would just like to support Council Member Schmidt's concern about modeling and somewhat the high risk of being wrong, and appreciate the City Council's reflective, careful thinking on this issue.
And we do have a time issue here because the tour at Cumberly starts at 6.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And
If you choose to go.
yes. So I know Commissioner Keller has a comment. I have some comments. I think Mr. Levy had one. Mr. Keene, you've been silent. Why don't
Well, I'll
City
do
Manager?
mine real quickly there. Just following up on Mr. Michael's comment about the facts. And of course, there are already two dueling economists here, which is almost better than a presidential debate. So mine's a very elementary comment. This chart about the slope of the line for the Bay Area job growth, I would point out that I think, as Mr. Levy pointed out, that over the 30-year period, 2010 through 2040, the job growth is at 41,000 jobs per year or whatever, or essentially sort of the historical average. That's what I heard. And the question is this slope of the line from 2010 to 2020. Is that too steep? And the point would be, even if that is too steep, over the 30-year period, it would balance out one way or another. So the question just comes into play that it's during this 2010 to 2020 period where the next round of the reallocation and the housing element comes into play in a, whatever that is, what's the year, 2014 through 2022. And so would the city be assigned a number that is higher in that period of time than it might otherwise be if somehow the historical average were more what turned out? Presumably in the next round or the one after that, then that would be adjusted downward either way. So I think that nobody's really said that the projection of over a 30-year period through 2040 that we're going to be less than the historical growth than we've had. I'm not sure I heard that. So I did just want to sort of point out that piece. Well, whatever the average of 41,000 jobs, whatever that is, maybe what was said, but a lot of the focus really seemed to be that a growth of 72,000 jobs a year that we'd seen over a 2-year period, was that logical to roughly extend that through the rest of the decade? So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not drawing any conclusions from that.
And I don't want to belabor the point, but I think Mayor Scharf, and I certainly, that was my understanding of what he said, and I are concerned that it's an upcycle for 30 years.
Can I ask a question on that? I mean,
Go ahead.
These are bad graphics because these graphics show yearly from 90 to 2010 every year, and then have, you know, 2 sections for the next 30 years. So I guess my question is exactly what Melissa was getting at, which is, you don't think that we're actually going to keep on growing for 30 years straight? That's what this bad graphic shows.
Right.
So here's what I'm going to ask. I think Councilmember Schmidt has a comment to make, and Mr. Levy has a comment to make, and you're going to get 1 minute so that we can get to Commissioner Keller. I can make some comments and do any other wrap-ups that we need to. We do have another item on the agenda.
Okay.
So
I heard a question.
Yes. So
Right.
so I'm giving you 1 minute to respond, and sorry for the short leash there.
The reason that the graph is in the report is that Ezra Rapport, who's the executive director at ABAG, said that many of his members were worried that since the Bay Area had lost a share of jobs between 1990 and 2010, that they would need an explanation as to why the share was likely to turn around. All right? The report and the text surrounding the graph provides that explanation. So the concern that you had and that Mayor Schaaf had was relayed to me, which is why that section of explaining why the future would be different than the past was put into the report. I would say that if I had been allowed and gone back to 1970, the share of Bay Area of the U.S. jobs is way upward, because between 1970 and 1990, the share just went straight up. What we're saying for the decade between 2010 and 2040 is that the share is going to go from something like 2.45% to 2.55%. It's not even going to regain the 1990 share. Again, if you want to make the case that this is a declining region, that's a technically appropriate case in which I would disagree that you don't have evidence. But it's not that we're going through the roof here. And remember that the ABAG projection has not 70,000, not 41,000, but 28,000 jobs a year after the recovery in 2020.
Thank you. Councilmember Schmidt. You have a minute?
I would just make the point. Just make the point that the law that we're dealing with, the housing law, states that the Department of Finance Demographic Research Unit is the group that's responsible for making a demographic forecast that has jobs and housing implications. That demographic forecast is 40% less number of people in the Bay Area than the ABAG 1 Bay Area plan. It doesn't mean prosperity is any less. As a matter of fact, maybe more. So it is divorced from talking about the prosperity of the Bay Area. And I think that's what has to be confronted when we talk about forecast.
Thank you. Commissioner Keller, you had a question or a comment?
Yes, I'll be quick. The first thing is that the data that was shown by Mr. Levy shows a 10-year boom. And since I've lived in Palo Alto since 1977, I don't think we've ever had a 10-year boom. There's always been recessions more often than that. And we're saying no recessions in the next 10 years. So that's. But anyway, let me go on. The second thing is I'm wondering if there are any structural incentives for ABAG to estimate high. And I don't know if anybody's investigated that. Maybe they try to get more money from the state by estimating more growth than they would otherwise have, and that might be a reason to do that. And the third thing is that this period from 2014 to 2022 is essentially set. We're now arguing on the margins with Stanford, and what we really need to do is do the groundwork for the next go-around so that we don't have this problem as much again, so we can make sure that the estimates are appropriate and that the allocation to Palo Alto is what it should be. And do that work starting now, so, because if we do it in 6 years, it's going to be too late. Thank you.
Curtis, do you have any comments or response to Commissioner Keller?
Well, I just wanted to add that it's my understanding that every 4 years this information is going to be updated. So I think his comment is correct. I think this is a great discussion, and we're starting to have discussions with some of the state legislators. And we need to have a way that we can be more a part of this projection process, and it happens in 4 years again, and feel more comfortable with it. And this is, I think, a great start.
Yeah. Curtis, it would be almost for certain that the next allocation will be higher, because under the law, HCD will consult with ABAG on the next allocation and use the growth forecast. Second, everybody's allocation from HCD is probably going to go up in the next cycle, because we argued very successfully with HCD this time that they should make allowance for all of the vacant units, which was done for ABAG and SCAG. And so the housing allocation for 2014 to 2022 for everybody is lower than it would otherwise have been, because HCD very reasonably understood that some of those households would be coming into existing vacant units, and some of the job growth would be existing people who were getting reemployed and wouldn't need housing. That's going to be substantially reduced in the next cycle. So I would expect the next cycle to have higher growth.
My comment was not towards what the conclusion
Right.
would be.
No,
It's just the process, that we can enter the process more informed than we were able to last time.
I don't see any other hands. First off, I want to thank Mr. Levy for coming and for enduring the during the rash of comments and questions and questioning, because it is a complicated subject, and I know to some it's clearer than to others, and you know, the dueling experts that we have here you know, presents a platform for a lot of dialogue and a lot of questions and a lot of consideration. My own comments are that I think at the heart of this discussion is what Mayor Scharf mentioned too, that it is the legislators that we need to be talking with, because there is a fair amount of discussion right now at the legislature about and with League of Cities as well, about local control. So that hasn't gotten very far so far, but it is certainly a topic of discussion, and Curtis probably knows more about that even than I do at this point in time, but it is on people's radar, having local control. The other thing that I would say that causes, you know, the long-range consequences of having to zone for housing. It's great to do long-range planning, and however the forecasting is done is a topic of obvious discussion as we've had here today. The part that lives on is if the forecasting is too high and we have zoned for the housing to be compliant with the mandates, that zoning can't go away. And Curtis can speak to that if you wish, but once we have zoned to be compliant with the housing element, that zoning will stay on the ground. We can't eliminate it if the projections are wrong. So we are stuck with the likelihood, which varies over time and through economies, when it will be built and the likelihood that it will be built, but it will, as demonstrations have shown over time, that it will be built. We've had situations in the city of Palo Alto where locations in Palo Alto were zoned for housing, and, you know, at one point in time we thought that was the best thing to do, was zone for housing. Not we, I use generally here, not this council or anybody in this room even. Over time, those have shown to be very bad decisions because you learn over time. But we've had some very bad consequences from the zoning not being correct. And that's one of my long-term concerns about zoning, using numbers that there's not great buy-in. I will put it that way, great buy-in as to whether the numbers are the best numbers to use or not, and what the long-range consequences and impacts are. But so just to reiterate, really encourage members of the public to attend the Planning Commission meeting. I appreciate Vice Chair's bringing that up. Also encourage you to write your legislators, if you have connections there especially, and forward your comments to the council, of course. But local control is a topic of discussion. Does staff want to conclude with any comments there?
Can I
Of
ask
course.
one question? So, because I feel like this has been good in terms of just being an informational session as well as a very robust debate. But for folks, you know, from the public who came and you know, this was something that I learned a couple of days ago that I found to be very helpful or enlightening, is that you know, ABAG, we have to zone for these housing units. They don't have to be built. And if units are zoned, for instance, from 2007 to the end of 2013, that are not built, and I want to confirm with you again on this, Curtis, but for instance, we might have approximately 1,400 units that we've zoned for from 2007 to 2014 that were not built. Those roll over to whatever our ABAG allocation is from 2014 to 2022. Is that correct?
I think that's correct, as long as we have a compliant housing.
As long as we have a compliant housing element. So that means that we're going to start off with a 2150, or if we get it down to 1800, whatever it is, we're starting off with 1,400 units already zoned. So we don't have to zone for a full additional 2,150 units. And I think that's something that I didn't know until 2 days ago, and I think really kind of changes a little bit of the impending disaster that folks might think that we're about to face. I think it's a little more manageable than if we had a zone for a whole new 2,150 units.
And thank you for that clarification. That is accurate. And my point was broader than that. It's like once they are, and I'm not, you know, you were right, and I appreciate you bringing that up. My point was that once they are zoned for housing, though, you can't roll it back. So both things are accurate, and that's a fine point to put on it. So, Councilmember Schmidt.
Just a question for school board members. I understand that we have been building at the rate of around 200 houses per year. Is that right?
Some folks in the audience couldn't hear. If you want to repeat what Greg.
The question was, that the actual housing growth has been about 200 new units a year for the last decade, and has the school district projected a lower number going forward. Yes. And one of the largest reason for that, the main reason for that, is that the demographers do not make assumptions about demographics when children haven't been born yet, and when housing isn't in the pipeline. So, does that answer your question?
Even more than that, it's not just housing's not in the pipeline, but if housing hasn't been approved. So we can talk all we want about the potential for something that's been zoned to turn into housing, but if it hasn't been approved, the demographers don't have it in. So,
and depending on the type of housing, as you all know, the typical student yield is somewhere between, and I know Art Keller would know this by heart, somewhere between 0.7 and 1.5 per household. So it's, even with respect to Councilmember Berman's points, the numbers are significant in terms of student yields. And they also, as we talked about last time, of course, the City Council doesn't have jurisdiction over Stanford, but Stanford housing and Stanford students, of course, enroll in Palo Alto schools. And there's significant housing, as you all know, underway and in the planning stages there.
Thank you for the question and the response. And again, thank you to Mr. Levy for coming, for doing your work, and responding to questions and comments. Very much appreciated.
Happy to know, I think,
The microphone.
the fertility rates are going down among all groups across the country. I don't know how it will affect Palo Alto. We're such a desirable area, but there will be, according to everybody that I know, fewer children born in California over the next 30 years than we had anticipated previously, and that might help with some of the angst about schools and stuff.
Last comment. Last comment.
Just that with due respect for Mr. Levy's point, which is a good one, and we don't have a crystal ball, but I would say that the enrollment in the school district went up during both of the past recessions, which is an anomaly, and I think reflective of the attraction of Palo Alto for families.
We agree.
So thank you for that, and with that, we will conclude item number 1. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We have one more item, item 2, housing element and arena updates. Staff?
Yes, this will be quick. On the housing element, the committee had seen that some time ago. We've been working with the Housing Community Development Department at the state on that document. We had submitted some revisions. We had a phone conference with them last week, and we're very close to getting their support on the document. There are a handful of minor revisions that we will get out to them by the end of the week, and then they'll have up to 30 days, and we think that what we'll get back is a letter saying if you make those revisions in your element that we'll certify it. And so before they actually do, we have to go back through the process and get those changes approved by the commission, this committee, and the council, and by the council. And we'll submit that back to the state, and usually then you get a letter of certification. So we believe that we'll be back to you, if not by your April meeting, then for sure by the May meeting. So hopefully by June we will have a compliant certified housing element. We're very close. And then the other item was, and you already heard Mayor Scharf mentioned, on the appeal to ABAG. Yesterday they did release the draft recommendations, and they recommended against our appeal, but also recommended that we continue to work with Stanford and the county on working out some kind of a trade agreement. We do have hopefully a meeting next week with county staff that they're supposed to get back to us on, and we'll be talking to them about seeing if something can break there. We're somewhat encouraged, but don't have anything definite at this point.
Do you have any sense? I mean, was there
logic.
Founding logic was it wasn't methodology based, it was jurisdictional based.
It was site-specific based, and they said RENA numbers are not site-specific. So the fact that we were pointing out these two sites that were close to transit, that were in the county and not in the city, was not valid, that these were allocations that were made based on jurisdictions, not based on whether the sites were specifically close to transit, that kind of thing. There were a couple other ones, but they generally felt like the methodology wasn't site-specific, so that wasn't the basis for ours. But
Remind me, I'm sorry, but what's the process now? So staff
So there is a hearing,
Okay.
an appeal hearing on April 1st, and we will make a presentation there. Mayor Scharf is the chair, actually, of the appeal committee, and obviously can't participate in that item, but that group of 6 or 7 individuals will make a recommendation then to the ABAG board, executive board.
I don't think Mr. Levy heard us when we mentioned earlier that staff had recommended against it. So I would suggest that we, make sure that he knows about that. Yeah.
Councilmember Schmidt?
Quick question. If the appeal on the Stanford gets turned down, do we have to adjust our numbers and identify 350?
No, we've already identified so we could adjust the other way and take off 350 if
that
we
would be
wanted to
very
do that.
straightforward.
But yeah, we've already planned for the 2179 that's in there right now.
Now, a second question, Mr. Levy pointed out that, there's likely to be much higher base numbers for the 2015-2022 housing element.
No, actually, it would be the
2022.
2022 to 2030.
Okay, that number is given to us, and it's the 2100.
That's given to us in 2028 or 2029 or something like that. But I do think, as I was saying, that they are going to actually look at, and it won't affect this period's RENA numbers, I guess. Maybe it could, but I don't think it will. But in 4 years, every 4 years, they're going to look at the SCS, the Sustainable Community Strategy, OBAG, numbers, and the projections, and so they'll adjust them every 4 years.
All right, thank you very much, Curtis. That will conclude item number 2. We had no public speakers on that on that item. Future meetings and agendas. Next meeting is April 11th. Is that correct?
That's correct. We'll see if we have something ready to go on the housing element by then. If not, we may not have that meeting.
Okay. All right, great.
April, what was the date?
11. April 11. Okay, seeing no other comments, we adjourn this meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chair.
Wow, this meeting's become more and more exciting every time.
I meant to stop and get some popcorn for this one, but
Yeah, we're not for that.
You know your microphones are on.
It's only positive.
that's right. No, it's, prognosticating numbers, everybody can be right and everybody can be wrong.